Great to have you here, Peter. Of course, I want to mention and talk about your latest book, The Hitler Legacy, the Nazi cult in diaspora, how it was organized, how it was funded, and why it remains a threat to global security in the age of terrorism. If that wasn't a punchline for a subtitle, if ever there was one. This is quite a unique genre that you researched, Peter. I can see why you have done this, Peter, because there is a necessity, as a very, very important necessity, because this has gone unnoticed. This has gone off the record. I mean, literally, we'll get into the JFK stuff as well, and I mean, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the secret space program, and the Nazis going to America, NASA space program, and how this all weaves together. But the point is, I think you probably agree, Peter, this has gone unnoticed until really recent years. That, I mean, I think in the 50s, the 60s, I mean, people that had no idea about this stuff, Peter. They just were totally oblivious to it all.
Well, sure. I mean, the 50s and the 60s were really just the aftermath of World War II, and World War II was framed in this idea that there was a Manichaean struggle between light and dark, you know, between good forces and the evil forces. Mm-hmm. And the evil forces were destroyed, defeated, and light prevailed, and all was right with the world. So there was this idea that, you know, you could compartmentalize reality into these boxes that were easily maneuverable and manageable. And so once we destroyed, you know, the Nazis, then it was a question of the Soviet Union. We needed another evil empire to combat. And so we had the Cold War. So people were so distracted. There was so much misdirection going on and so much disinformation that it was just overwhelming. So people basically took whatever they were told as the truth.
Mm. Yeah. Even me growing up, Peter, I mean, I knew about the Nazi scientists being sought after for their knowledge when the trenches fell, and especially in this part of the world, in Ireland, England, home to the front line as such in France and that. And we always just assumed, and we're taught this in schools, that these guys were just a couple of scientists. They weren't really anything to do with the war, but they had some knowledge and they were given an amnesty.
Sure.
It's really a lot different than that, Peter.
Oh, it is very, very different.
It's scary, Peter. This is scary that this has gone on.
I think it is. That's why I've been focusing so much on it for such a long time. At first, I wanted to find out what motivated people to become Nazis, what motivated the Third Reich in the first place, what created the Nazi Party, what was the idea, you know, the mentality behind it, which is when I wrote Unholy Alliance, because there's so much documentation on the fascination of the people who started the Nazi Party with occultism, esotericism, all of the sort of dark arts, you might say, as well as a lot of very strange racial theories and all the rest of it. They were like the sorcerer's apprentices, and they were going out about it particularly that way. They were creating a magical culture. I mean, the swastika would tell you that, if nothing else. I mean, what other symbol in the last 100 years has been that powerful? You just see it, and immediately you make associations with it. Sure. It's even banned in some countries. In Germany, you can't display it. It has such an enormous radioactivity, you might say. And I wanted to know what that was all about.
Mm. And to pay homage to its original source, you know, it was demonized. That was a good logo at one point in Sanskrit in ancient times.
Well, it still is. If you go to Asia today, if you go almost anywhere, from China to Japan, Korea, I lived in Malaysia for a number of years, Singapore, any place like that, you'll find the swastika is everywhere because it's used in Buddhist and Chinese Taoist temples. You'll see the swastika used in a lot of places without anybody giving it a second thought. But in the West, of course, as you say, it's been demonized. And the people who served the swastika were serving what they understood to be these sort of demonic masters. People in the UK and in Ireland, I'm sure you have a lot of stories about the rockets and the Blitz that came down that destroyed so much of London and so much of other parts of Europe. And the man who created that technology is the man we brought to the United States to help jumpstart our space program.
For sure.
So, you know, you can't say that these are just a couple of, you know, guys who were just, you know, forced into service by the Third Reich, you know, to do some science, and then we brought them over. I mean, Werner von Braun was a major in the SS. You know, I mean, the SS was not the Rotary Club. You know, you didn't become a major in the SS by simply paying dues every month or something. You know, this was a very serious situation. His boss was even worse, Walter Dornberger. These are people who employed slave labor from the camps. These are people who who worked these people to death, stepped over their bodies on their way into the labs. So let's not be, naive about the people that we brought over.
We'll get into that. I mean, and I want to focus on that. I mean, do we call these people evil or psychopaths, or at least attribute some sort of psychopathy to what they did? We'll get into that. I lived in Plymouth in the UK, in London, and it was really heavily bombed, and even on the roundabout there, you call them a rotary, I think, in America, but there's what we call the bombed out church. It's still an icon in the town to let people know that it was bombed during World War II. And if you asked anybody there, oh yeah, Hitler was the baddie and the swastika, and that's it. That's all people know. And these people lived through this as a wartime. It's still there they're still encouraged to remember the war. It's like a propaganda that's still perpetuated today. However, they have a very, and I too, I can be forgiven for it too, but we have a very sanitized version now, Peter. I want to focus on the occultism. This wasn't just a political party, Peter, that the Nazis rose to power, and it was a political party that got overtaken by one man, and he was a really successful dictator. We can't separate the occultism or the paganism or the esoteric wisdom that these guys had.
No, you can't. As I said in Unholy Alliance, and I've said it often since then, the Nazi Party was not a political party the way we understand political parties. The Nazi Party was a cult. You can't really describe it in any other way. These were not people who were overly concerned with the things that politicians are generally concerned about. These people were concerned with eradicating races that were considered inferior, of purifying the race. These were people who believed in occult powers. They believed in a sort of spiritual Darwinism, as I call it, where, races are evolving and the other races should be destroyed so they don't, dilute the gene pool. Mm-hmm. These are people who believed in a lot. I mean, if you watch the Nuremberg rallies, alone, that should tell you something. That should tell you this was not the normal political party the way we understand it. In fact, in Unholy Alliance, there's a couple of photographs of what is a torchlit ceremony among a lot of blonde, blue-eyed sort of types out there in the forests, welcoming in the summer solstice. And it's not taking place in Germany or Austria. It's taking place in Argentina. And this was a German community there that was a Nazi party encampment, you might say. And there was Hitler Youth, and there was the origins of an Argentine SS taking place, having candlelit ceremonies. Candlelit ceremonies in the woods on the day of the summer solstice. Is this a political party? Is this, in this country we have the Democrats and the Republicans. You don't see them holding candlelit ceremonies on the summer solstice. Maybe they do, but we just don't know. But in this case, this was what they were all about. They were about an occult view of reality, an occult view of the world and of history. Hitler makes no bones about that in Mein Kampf, but the people who really put that through were people like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who created an entire cult priesthood for the Nazi Party in the SS. Mm-hmm. Even had a castle built where ceremonies were undertaken, initiatory ceremonies and ceremonies to visualize and make contact with the Aryan ancestors. And all this kind of stuff was going on, and a fortune was being spent to promote this as well.
Sure. I hope I'm reading your bio, or at least a correct bio for you, Peter. You're from a telecommunications background, president of a telecommunications company. How do you get involved in this type of research? What is the attraction? Was there a catalyst there for you, Peter?
Well, I've been involved in international trade really since the 1970s. So that's how I got into traveling a great deal all around the world. And as I did, my eyes became open to a lot of things that when you're brought up in the United States, you think in a certain way. It's a kind of very parochial viewpoint you have of the world if you're born and raised in the United States. Mm-hmm. Once you start traveling to any degree, you begin to realize that the United States is not the entire universe. It's not the entire world. And you begin to see things from different points of view. And you can walk in the battlefields. You can walk in the places where people have suffered so much during various wars. I spent a lot of time in Asia, Europe, Latin America, Australia, almost everywhere. And you begin to realize that there's a lot more to history than what you're told in the history books. And this is important. And my being involved in international trade to a great deal also it encouraged me to learn a lot of different foreign languages. So I was able to, to communicate with people, the places where I went. I began to study their culture, their history, and that gave me access to a lot of information. So as it turned out, every time I was posted somewhere overseas, I used whatever available time I had, free time, in order to investigate these things that I write about, to investigate them even more deeply. Until now, it's become virtually my full-time profession.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Peter, wow. What a busy guy. I mean, I can understand getting outside America gives you a different viewpoint. I guess you guys maybe have a sanitized version of history over there too, or at least
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so. In fact, I went through, I graduated high school in the Bronx in 1968, which probably tells you how old I am. And at that time, we had history. I was an honors student in history, mm-hmm. but we never quite made it up to World War II. For some reason, you never quite made it that far. And I don't know what the reason was, but in all the history classes I ever took, World War II, we never quite made it that deeply in the textbooks. We ended around Sarajevo and, Archduke Ferdinand and World War I. And it was a very sanitized version of that as well. We didn't know what an Austro-Hungarian Empire was in the first place, or what that meant. So all of this was kind of murky, and you just had to memorize some names, dates, and places, and that was all. I had to do research on World War II on my own, and it was started with television. It started with old movies from the 40s and the 50s. Your education starts there, and you start to wonder, who are all these people, and why are the Germans always so well dressed and the Americans always look like slobs at this thing? What message are we being told? Mm-hmm. And I started to pull that apart layer by layer like an onion until I got deeper and deeper into it. And then there was Watergate, the Watergate scandal in our country. There was the Kennedy assassination, of course. There was Vietnam. All of these things made people of my generation very politically sensitive, let's say, if not politically aware, at least sensitive to, there were things in the world that were taking place. And we could become victims of that. I could have gone to Vietnam. I could have been, a grunt in the tall grass out there. So all of this made things seem more, immediate. And I think that was part of it. And then I started traveling a great deal, and that sort of solidified a lot of things for me.
In a personal sense, Peter, I don't get armies. I'm not a fighter. I'm a lover. I'm a peacemaker, but I do get the necessity for armies. You need to protect and defend. I get that. If we didn't have them, it would be a free-for-all, and it would be like the Wild West or something, So I get the necessity for them. However, I don't like the aggression and the war. That I think it's unnecessary. Yes, defend your borders, but to go to war for oil or whatever, I don't like that. I don't get it. I just think it's primitive. However, and I'm sitting here in the British Isles, and we're always taught to promote the World War II war heroes, and that's fine. I get that. But people cannot see past that, Peter. And what you're talking about today, and what we're going to provide the audience with, is this very discerning view of what's going on. I mean, I definitely think it's a promotion of national identity. They're promoting the ego of bravery, and that's all they want to do. However, when you look at World War II, Peter, it is everything of this century, the last century. I mean, everything that has happened since World War II. It's just had ripples going through history. Before it and after it. I mean, the whole last 100 years, Peter, is an incredibly interesting time to research. And World War II is just right smack bang in there.
Well, I agree 100%. And I've written and I've said on other interviews that we're basically still fighting World War I. I mean, World War I is where all of this nonsense was born.
Yeah.
And I think historians will look back, just as you've said. They will look back at the last 100 years, and they will call it the second 100 Years' War. And I think that's really what it is. We're still fighting that war. World War I hasn't stopped. It looks as though there were moments of peace where we were not fighting, but actually there were constant revolutions, constant fighting, constant conflict since World War I. Since that time until now, it has not stopped. So there is no, we talk about a Cold War, but that was between the United States and Russia. The rest of the world was in flames. You had Southeast Asia in flames. You had Latin America in flames. Mm-hmm. The Middle East was a basket case. I mean, all of this has been going on for 100 years. And we're still living with it, and it's much more insidious than we think it is. We tend to box these things in little nice compartments. There's World War I, that was over. Then there's World War II, 20 years later. I'm sorry, World War I morphed into World War II. You know, these are just conveniences of this. They're you know, easy ways of referring to certain periods of history, but they're kind of meaningless. World War I and World War II is the same war.
Sure. I want to concentrate on what you call the American Reich, these Nazis coming to America, and I also want to get into the secret space program, maybe starting with Maury Island. I mean, it's a lot of information to talk about and get into, Peter, but it's relevant because it all weaves together inevitably, and it is, like we're talking about, the ripples of history just keeps on going. It's very sinister, it's very dark, and it's not portrayed in any way open. It's literally, if you can find the research and do it, you'll find some answers. So maybe we'll talk about Maury Island affair. Kenneth Arnold will talk about that episode. Maybe try and get a good solid background on that, and then maybe get into some of the American Reich and how it all weaves together.
Sure. Well, Maury Island is one of the most contentious, controversial episodes in recent American history. 1947, you had a guy called Fred Krisman and a guy called Harold Dahl, and they were out in Puget Sound in the Pacific Northwest. And according to the story that we've come to hear it, there was a UFO of some sort, or a group of UFOs, a cluster of them, flying over Harold in his boat out in the water with his son and a dog. And one of the flying craft seemed to be in trouble of some kind, and parts of it fell off and fell into the water, and parts of it fell into the boat where Harold was sailing, injuring his son and killing his dog, if I remember the story correctly. So Harold comes back into port. He contacts his partner, Fred Krisman. He says there were UFOs. I have pieces of it here. I have the slag, which came from the flying saucer. And Krisman and Harold decide they're going to notify the authorities that they've been visited by a UFO. Kenneth Arnold, who was famous for his UFO sighting, he's the one who created the term flying saucer. A pilot, an experienced aviator, comes down to take a look at this, to discuss this with Krisman and Dahl. A lot of strange things happen. The hotel room where they meet is evidently bugged. Newspapers have evidently the entire story of this meeting. This is starting to get a lot of publicity. There was a UFO and it crashed, or somehow parts of it fell onto Harold. Two Air Force, at this point, U.S. Army Air Force, the U.S. Air Force had not yet been created. So the Army Air Corps people show up, two officers. They talk to Krisman and Dahl. They don't know what to make of this, evidently. I think they thought it was probably a hoax. The place is bugged. A lot of the newspapers, local newspapers, seem to have the entire story of what's going on. Nobody understands how. They have transcripts of meetings between Harold Dahl, Krisman, Kenneth Arnold, all these guys. The whole thing is very strange, very murky. The Air Corps gentlemen show up, two officers, and they take possession of a box of chunks of rock that Krisman said came from the flying saucer. Wow. They take it aboard their aircraft, a military plane. They're flying back to base, and their plane blows up in midair, and the officers die. And that was the Maury Island incident. Now, there's a lot of people who claim that this never happened, that this was invented. This was a story that Harold Dahl invented or Fred Krisman invented. There's been a lot of back and forth on that, and yet there's so much of the incident that is otherwise we can't imagine what they're talking about, because there's so much that doesn't make sense. If it was really a hoax, I mean, they didn't blow up the plane on their own, right?
Sure.
Was Krisman planning a bomb on the plane for some reason? You know, then we start peeling back the layers of this thing, and we find out that Fred Krisman had been in American intelligence during the war. He claimed he was with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA.
Yeah.
He claimed he flew over the hump, which means in Asia, Burma, that part of the world, flying over the Himalayas. And now he's some sort of nondescript kind of guy living up in the Pacific Northwest. And this is in 1947. 20 years later, the same Fred Krisman, the same guy who was involved in the Maury Island affair, the supposed hoax, UFO, weird UFO story, becomes a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. So Jim Garrison, who was the district attorney in New Orleans, made famous by Kevin Costner in the movie JFK. Jim Garrison then subpoenas Fred Krisman to testify. because Chrisman has all these murky intelligence connections. He has connections with the Minutemen. At that time, it was a kind of a militia, a kind of extreme right, far right-wing militia that was believed to be implicated in the Kennedy assassination. And all of this is going on. But at the same time, Garrison's major focus was what was happening with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, and Oswald's connection to a man called Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was running a kind of a private eye outfit in New Orleans, and the same address that Lee Harvey Oswald used as his address for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was supposed to be a pro-Castro organization, whereas Bannister was definitely anti-Castro. The whole thing was very strange. Garrison was trying to figure out what all that meant. What Garrison didn't know, he knew that Guy Bannister was an FBI agent. He knew that he was a special agent in charge up in Chicago. He has an illustrious career as an FBI agent for so many years. Mm-hmm. What he didn't know was that Bannister was involved in the 1947 UFO sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Guy Bannister was reporting directly to J. Edgar Hoover. His telexes still survive. The memos that he wrote have still survived. They've been actually declassified. They're on the FBI's own website, I believe. And it's signed Guy Bannister, W.G. Bannister, WGB, his initials. And we know that's where he was at the time. He was in the Pacific Northwest, and he was keeping track of all the UFO reports that were going on there. And the designation given to those FBI files on UFOs were very simple. They were called the X files. And this is not an invention. You can look at the teletypes. You can look at the memos. They're always referred to as Subject X. And Subject X always referred to the UFOs and alien sightings and abductions and that sort of thing. So here we have Guy Bannister in New Orleans, who was investigating Fred Chrisman in New Orleans. Both involved in the UFO sightings, now both considered central to the investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy.
Wowzer. It's just so surreptitious and murky. It's incredible.
Well, what are the odds? What are the odds of that happening? I mean, it's incredible. What does it mean? Does it mean the UFO experience was disinformation? Was it some kind of strange intelligence operation that was being conducted that even Hoover didn't know about, because Hoover wanted all the files on this? He wanted everybody, all his agents in the field, to report all the UFO stuff to him immediately. So Hoover was in the dark. Was it the fledgling CIA that was conducting this? It seems unlikely. They were hardly wet behind the ears yet in 1947. Was it American military intelligence? What was it? Who was behind this? If it was a disinformation operation, it raises so many questions. And how is it all connected to the Kennedy assassination? Is it the same group of people?
Like I say, I've had a few shows on JFK or conspiracy theories, if you call them that. I don't like it. It's a derogatory term. I think
exactly.
As a conspiracy theory, it was coined for that purpose, to be derogatory. But one man's conspiracy theorist is the next man's critical thinker. But in that respect, you think if the JFK thing hadn't have happened, I mean, look how many false flags have happened after that. I think either they were arrogant, or confidence, or after pulling off the JFK assassination, that they just went, well, what else can we do? I mean, I think it was an open book after that, when you look at history.
Well, sure. I mean, after the Kennedy assassination, they pretty much had free reign, free run of the country. I mean, they did whatever they wanted to do. Vietnam being, an excellent example of that. But all of the other adventures we were involved in around the world and domestically, the domestic spying programs, COINTELPRO and all the rest of it, they suddenly had a free reign. Whoever was behind this, when they could get away with the assassination, well, you can get away with anything then. I mean, the Warren Commission itself seemed like a perfect disinformation project, if nothing else. So, yeah, there is some connection here. And we're talking about secret space programs and all the rest of it. There is something else going on, and has been going on at least since the end of World War II. At least since the time we brought over the Nazi scientists, which brings us back again to 1947.
Sure.
It brings us back to Dornberger and Werner von Braun, and they were taken to Wright Air Force Base. At that time, it wasn't Wright-Patterson yet. They're at Wright Air Force Base when the pieces of the supposed UFO crash at Roswell are taken there. So the pieces of the Roswell crash are taken to Wright Air Force Base, and the Nazi scientists are brought specifically to Wright Air Force Base, and everybody's kept under wraps. The pieces of the craft are kept under wraps. The Nazis are kept under wraps. We don't know what was going on there. Nobody's talking about what actually they went through at that time, why they were brought there at that particular month and year. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of events, especially when, as it turned out, some of the people who were peripheral to the Kennedy assassination investigation, people like Michael Paine, whose wife Ruth Paine had her home open to the Oswalds. Marina Oswald and her children stayed there. Lee stayed there occasionally in Texas. Her husband, Michael Paine, worked for Bell Aerospace, worked for Walter Dornberger, let's say. So, I mean, there was a NASA involvement, a space program involvement in this since the earliest times. Oswald at one point was bragging he was going to get a job in the space industry. Wow. Other co-workers of his found jobs related to the space industry in Huntsville, Alabama, where Werner von Braun eventually was headquartered. The whole thing was very, very mysterious. And if we're looking at an occult angle, we need look no further than Jack Parsons.
Jack Parsons, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here's the other angle of this. Here's Jack Parsons. He's out there in California. He's basically the father of the American rocket program. He was a rocket scientist. He was also deeply involved in the occult and in occult works. And his friends, his coworkers, his colleagues all knew about it. It wasn't a mystery at all. And he was the person who basically not only jump-started America's rocket program, he jump-started Scientology too. So.
Wow. Yeah. We're talking a very sinister, illustrious syndicate of people here, all around the same era, either playing with the public opinion or manipulating media, not quite sure what their agenda would be. Maybe they were doing a trial and run to see what they could do, perhaps, with the media of the public.
Well, the people who eventually became in control of our media, particularly our advertising, but also a lot of our magazines like Life and Look, these people, the actual individuals, used to work for the American Army in the propaganda department in psychological warfare operations. The gentleman who took over, his name escapes me at the moment, but at 666 Fifth Avenue up there, the headquarters of Time Life, Jackson. C. Jackson worked for Eisenhower as head of propaganda. He then became your ultimate Madison Avenue man, your ultimate advertiser. Advertising itself became an actual science at the end of World War II when all the psychological warfare guys got jobs on Madison Avenue. So the idea is that advertising and public media can be used to create and to form and manipulate public opinion is something that was known in World War II. Eisenhower used it extensively. They dropped leaflets all over Europe, telling people that the war was almost over, rise up against your occupiers, et cetera, et cetera. All sorts of strange propaganda devices were used at that time. And the guys who invented that saw how useful it was and then came back to the United States to use it on American citizens, essentially, which is what happened. Declassified CIA files on propaganda they used in Vietnam, they used in Southeast Asia, show how deliberately propaganda and media advertising was used to create public opinion, to manipulate it, to turn it the way that we wanted it, from Africa to the Middle East to Southeast Asia. This was something that was considered a science. People used psychological warfare because it was more efficient. If you could get people to lay down their arms or to figure that the war is unwinnable, you can win a war without firing a shot. Oh, and sure. This was the idea.
Sure. Let's step back to Oswald. I want to talk about Oswald for a second. People paint him as a dummy or some sort of a low IQ individual in this whole game, but the evidence suggests that this guy was very intelligent.
Absolutely. I mean, I was 13 years old when Kennedy was assassinated. Oswald was given to us almost immediately as the assassin. He was portrayed as some crazy guy who had defected to Russia and then came back to the United States and hated Kennedy and shot him. And that was the story that we all heard. But as I started to look at that a bit more deeply, one thing especially stood out. Now, I've studied languages for a long time. I took Latin in school, French, Spanish, learned a lot of other languages along the way. Oswald was fluent in Russian. Now, Russian is a really difficult language to learn. Oh, sure. Its grammatical structure is a bit like Latin. There's a lot of different cases that one has to to memorize. You have to understand how that works. The pronunciation is difficult. The alphabet, of course, is Cyrillic. You have to do. It's difficult. Let me just put it this way. Take it from me, it's a difficult language to learn.
My other half is Russian, so I know. But I took me a year. It took me a year to learn about 10 phrases. I've tried my best because I think it's a nice thing to do, but it's incredibly difficult pronunciation. And I speak Gaelic as well, so I know what it's like to speak strange languages. But Russian is up there without a doubt.
You know, I studied Gaelic in the Bronx for about a month. Just
did you?
Since you brought that up, yes, I didn't really retain much of it, but I did study it for a while. There was an Irish Gaelic language thing up in Fordham Road.
Oh wow!
But anyway, yes, Russian is very difficult. The fact that Lee spoke it fluently enough that he was mistaken for a Russian in Russia, meant that he was not as stupid as we were led to believe. Some of his diary entries, some of the things that he was reading, some of the opinions that he expressed show that he was actually a bit of an intellectual. He was able to express himself pretty well in public speaking, and I do not buy the story that Lee was, some sort of bumpkin. Lee actually, since we're talking about the Bronx, Lee Harvey Oswald did live in the Bronx as well for a while. Yeah. Just by the way. So here's a person who worked for the Marines. He worked at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan. He was entrusted with some very top secret missions. He was involved, of course, with the U-2 flights. He was involved with that very deeply. They suspected him of having had something to do with the shoot down of a U-2 over Russia, the Francis Gary Powers incident. Wow. As we find out later from Fletcher Prouty, among others, Lee was probably involved in some of the clandestine work that was being undertaken in Indonesia in the late 1950s when the CIA was trying unsuccessfully at the time to oust President Sukarno. So Lee was around. He was in the Philippines. We know that. He was based there, which was a base of operations against Indonesia. We know he was in Japan. We know that he was entrusted with a lot of top secret work. He spoke Russian fluently. He defects to the Soviet Union and then redefects back to the United States without by your leave, just sort of walks off the boat and everything is fine. A defector in the height of the Cold War whose wife is the niece of a military intelligence colonel. Steps off the boat and is welcomed with open arms at the United States like nothing happened. Come on.
Do you think he defected with the intention to defect back again to bring back the knowledge?
Well, I don't think he really defected. In Hitler Legacy, I mentioned there's a very strange incident which happened just before he went to Russia. He had applied to and been accepted at a strange college in Switzerland called the Albert Schweitzer University or Albert Schweitzer College. In a tiny town up in the Alps, in the middle of nowhere. He applies. There's a guy who barely graduated high school from all that we know. We don't know much, but he barely graduated high school. He actually sends a letter, and I think $20, which in 1960 was a lot of money. 1959 was a lot of money in those days. Sure. Sent that money to the college, got a letter back saying he was accepted into that term. Again, there's no paperwork on this. There's no, when you apply to a university, you have to write letters, you have to write essays, you have to do all sorts of things. You have to bend over backwards. And this was a very small college that very few people knew anything about, that it even existed. This is not the kind of college that advertised in flyers and leaflets at high schools. You had to know somebody who knew this place existed. He applied, was accepted, no problem. He was going there, and instead of going to Switzerland on that trip, he went up to Finland and across into Russia, and the rest is history. What was that all about? And that's never been satisfactorily explained either.
The American military-industrial complex, if you call it that, these guys invented the IQ test to process the military personnel as they come in the door. And I know for a fact that he didn't do all that without being incredibly intelligent. And he would have been the one that pulls the trigger, a foot soldier, or somebody maybe builds a bridge, or they break you all up for your intellect and for what they can get out of you. I know he did not do all that without having some serious intelligence, or at least being recognized for some sort of a skill set.
Sure. And one more thing, since you bring up the IQ test was invented by the military, so was the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was an invention of the American military. I have a copy of the very first DSM-1, which has the imprint of the United States Army on it. This was invented to find out how they could keep the soldiers still fighting after they had trauma, they had a nervous breakdown or whatever, to try to separate those who were really sick from those who were just faking it. And the DSM, the Bible of American psychiatry, was created because the Army needed it. So we have to really go back and we look at what the Army had its fingers in, everything from the space program to mental illness to, as you say, IQ tests. And we have to ask ourselves, are we really just a creature of the American military industrial complex?
For sure, for sure. I want you to tell me about this phony church, Peter. I think this is incredible. I absolutely think this is incredible. I mean, when I look at the information that you've presented, Peter, it's watertight for me, I mean, I'm like, this doesn't add up. I mean, what the hell is going on with all this stuff, Peter?
Well, that's exactly the reaction that Jim Garrison had, the DA of New Orleans, who brought the case against Clay Shaw in the Kennedy assassination. I have copies of letters that he wrote to Congress when the House committee was reopening investigations into the assassinations. And Garrison says, I cannot make heads or tails out of this church business. They're all over this thing. I don't know what it means. Can you just go and find out yourselves, please? And I was 18 years old, I guess, when Garrison was prosecuting Clay Shaw, and did not realize at the time that I was a handshake away from all of this, because once again, we go back to New York, we go back to the Bronx. It was 1968. I was graduating high school that year, and I became involved with a very mysterious church, also headquartered in the Bronx. In fact, within walking distance of the Bronx Zoo, which is probably appropriate. And here was a church which had no parishioners. There was no laity of any kind. Nobody attended services, but it had lots and lots of bishops. It was a church. It was basically a mill for producing bishops and clergy of various kinds. It was run by a man called Profeta, Vladimir or Walter Profeta, former Ukrainian Orthodox priest, violent anti-communist, and a friend of J. Edgar Hoover. Profeta created this church as a kind of front. While I was there, the year or so that I was involved directly with the church, I saw all kinds of people arriving from all sorts of foreign countries around the world, who would show up for a day, become consecrated, quote unquote, made into a bishop, given papers, nicely printed documents, and then they would sent off again. They would disappear into their own countries. People from Italy, people from Africa, from all over the place. Wow. So these were not priests. Okay, these are people with no training in theology, in liturgics, and patristics, or any of the stuff that you would normally associate with being trained as a priest, much less a bishop. And all of these people were, being flown in and out. They were moving in and out of this. And at the time, Profeta bragged to me that on his board of directors, he had one agent of the CIA and one agent of the FBI. And while I was there one day, a bunch of FBI did show up in their wingtips and their black suits and their white shirts and went into an office to have some words with Profeta and left again, and all was right with the world. Yes, the fake church stuff, I did not realize at the time. And I only got real confirmation really only about a year ago, less than a year ago,
Sure.
Although I knew it myself for sure. The connection between the church in the Bronx and the events in New Orleans is absolute. I began to research the fake churches for Sinister Forces because I had been intimately involved with them. And I began to realize that in some of the Warren Commission documentation, that church is referenced, the church that I was a member of, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. It's AOCC, and it's right there. And they're talking to people that I knew, or whose names I knew at the time. And I'm thinking, what the hell is this about? So I start to try to investigate this, and I start really backtracking and found some of the old bishops who were still alive around the country, made contact with them, sometimes personally, sometimes by phone or email or letters, and slowly the story began to piece together. This was an intelligence operation of the first order. You could not become a bishop in the American Orthodox Catholic Church unless the FBI approved of it. And who was doing the background checks was a guy called Jack Martin. Now, Jack Martin in the movie JFK was played by Jack Lemmon. Yeah. He was the guy who worked out of Guy Bannister's office, who got pistol whipped by Guy Bannister when he threatened to reveal what was really going on. Jack Martin stayed a priest and a bishop long after the Kennedy assassination. I have photographs of him dressed as a priest. Mm-hmm. His associate was David Ferry. David Ferry played, of course, by Joe Pesci in the film, the guy with the fake red hair and the fake eyebrows and all of that. David Ferry was another bishop in this particular church. So these people were all connected to the American Orthodox Catholic Church, which was used to run agents around the world. you don't remember necessarily, I guess you're not old enough, or American, but in those days in the United States,
Yeah.
in the 1950s, 1960s, if you were dressed as a priest, you could go anywhere.
Same in Ireland,
Well, Ireland, yeah, I guess so. Sure.
Well, I mean, you were respected. You were like an entity not to be crossed, not to be spoken to, or, respected. It was like you might as well be a business tycoon or a multimillionaire or something. You got the same sort of status in a way, socially anyway.
Exactly.
Socially.
Exactly. Absolutely. And, in those days, in 1968, when I was involved with the church and I'm wearing a cassock, the black cassock with the collar, I could get on a bus and not pay anything. I could go into a restaurant and my bill would be picked up by the manager. I mean, all this, the kind of stuff you would normally do for cops, they did for priests. And I began to realize much later on that David Ferry dressed as a priest, Jack Martin dressed as a priest. If there was somebody in a hospital that you wanted taken out permanently, you send in a priest. I mean, no one's going to stop a priest from visiting at any time of the day or night in those days to visit somebody in intensive care, maybe, or to visit someone in the hospital. And they come out and you've killed a person. No one would know. No one would be the wiser.
Cover. What a perfect cover. This sounds like somewhere in between Get Smart and the Burn Supremacy.
Yes, right.
Somewhere in between the two. Certainly Get Smart for the time era, but
yeah,
incredibly fascinating. Okay. We have a perfect front. We have this network, perhaps, of these people developing their skills. Let's go back to the Nazi influence. Let's just talk about I'm an engineer. I know how sophisticated the engineering of skill set that these engineers had in the World War II Nazi camps. Like, these guys were so above everything else. They were incredibly sought after. That was the main idea of Project Paperclip, to get these guys onto American soil to get their knowledge. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, we fought with the Russians over this. The Russians got their scientists, their Nazi scientists. We got ours. Not just the scientists, but also the drawings, the engineering documents, the plans, prototypes, pieces of technology that we managed to get out. Yeah, of course. The idea was to bring these guys on our side, but there was also another element to this. And that was, there was an understanding, I think, among the American military, especially the American military back home, Pentagon-type officials, that the Nazis and the Americans had a common enemy in the Soviet Union. General Patton once famously declared that we had been pointing our guns in the wrong direction. He begged Truman to allow him to invade Russia, using the German troops that he had captured. Give them back their guns, and let's go in and finish this once and for all. So there was this idea that Germany really represented an ally in the fight against quote-unquote godless communism. And even the Catholic Church was on board with that, as we know. I've written about that extensively, the way the Church helped the Nazi war criminals to escape around the world, the lengths to which they went in order to ensure that these people survived, because they felt they were fellow travelers. They were on the same side against communism. This kind of fascism was idolized. The military in general, let's face it, the military is not a socialist kind of democracy. The military is a top-down hierarchy, and they admire top-down hierarchies. They have an affinity for it. And I think they saw the Nazis as the ultimate top-down hierarchy, the ultimate fighting machine. And they wanted to incorporate as many of these people as possible on their side. So it wasn't just a question of, we need German scientists because they know something we need to know. That was definitely part of the plan. But also they felt comfortable dealing with these guys. They felt comfortable dealing with people who wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, who thought that there were mongrel races taking over the world, who wanted to purify the race, keep it for white people. We tend to forget that America in 1945 was extremely racist. There were laws on the books in many states against marrying people of other races, having children by them, and not just against black people, but there were laws in the books against Filipinos, for instance. In California and the American Southwest, you couldn't marry a Filipino. You couldn't have children with them. There was forced sterilizations. There was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was killing black men by infecting them with syphilis. There were all sorts of things that were taking place in the United States that really ran parallel to the eugenics programs in Nazi Germany. There were a lot of scientists who were sympathetic, morally, ethically, culturally and spiritually with their German counterparts. It was not that alien, a relationship. It was actually pretty cozy, I think, not just because we needed their science, but because we felt that they were thinking along the same lines that we did.
Let's talk the time period 20 years after 1947, say 1947 to 67, somewhere around that. So the time Kennedy was assassinated, that 20-year period. I mean, what do we know about the absorption of the Nazi influence coming to America? Did they absorb everything? Did they absorb the cultism? I'm talking the esoteric, the paganism, the occultism. Did they absorb the whole lot of that? Or was it just the technology? Or was it just their tactics? Was it everything? Did they absorb the whole lot?
Well, it broke down this way. You can draw kind of a line through a piece of paper. On one side of the line, there are the Nazis who were the technicians, the scientists, the ones who were helping the space program, not just the space program to go to the moon, but developing missiles, rockets, weapons of mass destruction. So you have that group. Mm-hmm. They may be esoterically minded or not. Some were, some weren't. But on the other side of the paper were the Nazis who were the political people, the political officers. Mm. And the political Nazis were very much imbued with the esoteric ideals of the party, because that's, as I said, the political party was a cult. It wasn't really a political party. Yeah. So those who were politicians, people who were minded that way, people who were involved, for instance, in South America. Klaus Barbie is an excellent example. Here's Klaus Barbie. Here's a man who was not a scientist or a technician at all. But we helped him to escape as well. That much is known. That much is solidly documented. We helped Barbie escape. We knew that Barbie was in Bolivia. We knew that Barbie became head of the Bolivian secret police for a while. He had a government post in which he was terrorizing Bolivians and people all over South America as part of Operation Condor. We have Nazis all over Latin America who were not scientists, but we have them in place to develop the politics necessary to defeat communism there. So we had a two-pronged approach. We had the Nazis who were the scientists, and we had the Nazis who were the quote-unquote political people. These were the SS officers. These were the war criminals as well. And these were people who did what they did because they were true believers. Mm-hmm. You don't destroy a belief by killing its members. The Catholic Church proved that itself. It survived for 350 years until it became a state religion in Rome. And the Christians were persecuted. They met in cemeteries. They were killed. They were thrown into the lions in the Colosseum. All this stuff was happening, but the cult did not die. And now we face the same problem with the Nazi Party. The cult will change. It will morph. It will put on different clothing, different types of uniforms. But in the end, the belief system doesn't die. And this is what I try to point out in Hitler Legacy, Unholy Alliance, Ratline, all the books that I've written on the Nazis, is that the cult idea, their ideals, do not die.
For sure. Of course, we can get your books at peterlevenda.com. I know you got a Contact in the Desert conference coming up too. Looking forward to seeing that, Peter. That's in May, is that correct?
That's the end of May at Joshua Tree, right?
Oh, awesome. Peter, let's talk South America. Do you think Nazis went to South America on their own without any American knowledge? I think how many Nazis might have escaped to South America? Do we have an idea? Did they all get found out eventually?
Oh, no. Thousands, literally thousands escaped. Remember, we weren't looking for all of them. We had a list of those we wanted for war crimes. Mm-hmm. The list was rather small, a few hundred names maybe at most, but thousands more went as well. An entire Waffen-SS division, the Ukrainian Waffen-SS division, was basically given the blessing of the U.S. government and allowed to leave and come to the United States for the most part. In South America, we had so many escapees, people who were not on anybody's list, but people who were true believers nonetheless. People who had belonged to the SS, but who had become, quote-unquote, denazified. One good example of a Nazi who was denazified was Hans Ulrich Rudel. Rudel was a very famous fighter pilot during World War II for the Nazis, for the Luftwaffe. Rudel was a famous guy, well-known, wrote his autobiography, a charming person, a charismatic type, but he was one of the people with Otto Skorzeny, another famous commando, who basically ran the Nazi underground after the war. And when I say ran it, I mean financed it, gave it moral support, went to meetings, helped make sure everybody was on the same page. In Hitler Legacy, I actually append Rudel's address book, in which you will find hundreds and hundreds of names. Some of these people are still alive. In Latin America, in North America, in Europe, all over the world. people who are still alive who were part of Rudel's network. These were Nazis and fellow travelers who were keeping the flame alive. We didn't go after people just because they were Nazis. We went after them under specific criteria that made them war criminals. If you belong to the SS, you belong to a proscribed criminal organization. You were going to be arrested if you belonged to the SS. And we know there were millions of people involved in the SS. These people would be arrested and denazified and sent back out into the streets. That meant that we figured, well, they didn't commit too many crimes. We don't have enough evidence against them. They're allowed to go. So they never showed up on a list. They did show up, however, in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, in Uruguay, Paraguay, everywhere, in Peru and Bolivia. There's a whole history of pro-Nazi sentiment in Latin America. And we have to understand that pro-Nazi sentiment was often anti-American sentiment. So the two things became mixed together. So the Northern Empire of the United States was evil, and everybody was sympathetic to the Nazis who were fighting colonialism. I mean, that was the sort of leitmotif of World War II, was that Germany was fighting colonialism, Japan was fighting colonialism in the Pacific. Mm-hmm. They were getting rid of the British colonies, the Dutch colonies, et cetera, et cetera. So this was supposed to make all the other people in the world feel sympathetic towards their plight. So Argentina did not declare war on Germany until a couple of days before the end. The same with Chile, the same with the other countries. They were very pro-Nazi. Mm-hmm. And so it was safe haven for thousands of people who had these sentiments.
Wow. Wow. Obviously, the big question then, did Hitler escape? That's the biggest one. He's been reported to God knows how many places now. Do you find evidence for that, Peter, or have you looked into that?
Well, I've looked into it a lot in my book, Ratline, which is pretty much concerned with that issue. I present the evidence there. From my point of view, I think for any reasonable point of view, any reasonable person would look at the available evidence and realize there is no evidence. There's no forensic evidence to prove that Hitler died in the bunker. There's no evidence at all. There's no body. There's no corpus delicti. There's no fragments of Hitler's brain, of Hitler's skull. The skull they had in Moscow was proved to be a fake. The Russians themselves are extremely inconsistent as to what they did supposedly with Hitler's body. There is no evidence that he died. None at all. There's eyewitness testimony, and the eyewitnesses are all SS. And of course, what possible motivation would they have to lie to us? And the SS who were captured by the Soviets told the Soviets one story. The ones that were captured by the Brits told the Brits a different story. The ones we captured, the Americans captured, told a different story. There was nothing consistent. In some cases, Hitler shot himself. In other cases, he took cyanide. In another case, he was shot by someone else. And in other cases, well, nobody really knows because no one saw the body. There's just too much that doesn't make any sense. Goebbels and his family, the Reich's propaganda minister, he and his 6 children and his wife, all those bodies were found, definitively proven that they died in the bunker. But for some reason, Hitler and Eva Braun, there's no forensic evidence at all. Nothing. It looked like an insurance scam where fake bodies were put. There were doubles. Sure. There were dentures that had been made by a dentist in the days before the end. Why was Hitler getting dentures made in the days before he was going to commit suicide? It's anybody's guess. Why Eva Braun would get dentures made at that time? Anybody's guess. They went and got dentures made. They got 2 sets of dentures made. One set was found in the smoking ruins of what was supposed to be their bodies, and which turned out not to be their bodies. So there's no evidence that he died. There is evidence, I would suggest, very strong evidence, that he did escape and did live in exile for a while somewhere, whether that was South America or, as I suggest, even further away in Southeast Asia.
Wow, really?
These are all possibilities. Southeast
Asia, I haven't heard that one before. I think a lot of people reckons I don't buy the South America. The heat would be too much for him over there.
Exactly what I say in my book on the Southeast Asia idea, the book Ratline. Yeah. Why would Hitler, who didn't trust anybody anymore, who couldn't trust his army, they tried to kill him in July of 44, the famous Operation Valkyrie. The army tried to kill him. His own Heinrich Himmler was trying to cut a deal with the West. Everybody was betraying him. Hitler would not have gone to South America, where any 2-bit Nazi would have dropped a dime on him, as we say, and reported him in return for a reward or for some special status. No, I think that Hitler would not have gone to South America. He may have passed through it. He may have gone there briefly, but I think he would have been crazy to go there. I think he would have gone to some place where no one would ever think to look for him, where there was a strong Muslim population, where there might have been some nascent, anti-Semitism. And he idolized, to a certain extent, Islam, although he didn't care for Arabs very much. He idolized the idea that Islam was what he called a manly religion, a vigorous sort of masculine religion of warriors. Heinrich Himmler felt the same. So when I was in Indonesia a few years ago, I was hearing constant rumors that Hitler had escaped to Indonesia, to a remote island, all the way to the east of Java.
Wow.
And I began to research that story, and you'd be surprised at how much evidence there was that at least some Nazis did escape to that part of the world, some important Nazis, and it may have something to do with the missing Nazi treasury as well, some of the missing Nazi gold. And I talk about that in Ratline and in Hitler Legacy.
Wow. Let's go back to Kennedy for a moment. Do you think Kennedy was the last frontier for these sinister group? Do you think if he was removed, we haven't even tackled why he was assassinated? Personally, this space race, as it's called, was he as a proponent for the space race? Was that a good reason to assassinate him? I don't know.
He proposed working with the Soviet Union on a joint program to conquer space. And I think the military-industrial complex in the United States would die before they would allow that to happen. Because that would have meant opening up their files to the Soviets. That would have meant allowing them to share technology, which they had gone to great lengths to keep away from the Soviets by taking those very Nazi scientists away. So I think that, our military-industrial complex here would have not wanted under any circumstances to work with the Soviet Union. And I think once Kennedy mentioned that, he had cut a deal with Khrushchev over Cuba already, which already made a lot of people very antagonistic towards him. He vowed never to invade Cuba. If the Russians kept their missiles out, that was considered to be something that he should not have done. So a lot of the military were against him for that. He was, as we all know, talking about withdrawing troops from Vietnam. So all of these things were going against one entity in the United States. That was the complex, the military-industrial complex. He was antagonizing them. And those people easily can manipulate the far right in this country, because the right wing in the United States is very manipulatable when it comes to these sorts of things.
There must have been a renegade faction at the time of, I should say a well-established renegade faction within his own government. I mean, it wasn't just a couple of people that plotted against him. I think this was a very well-established Sinister. I think he was aware of that perhaps too, Peter, that he had no control over it. There was a Sinister faction.
No, I think he was aware of it. I think he, just a few days before he was assassinated, he even talked openly of the fact that he may not even last one term, to run for the second term. He was in doubt about that. He had fired Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, over Bay of Pigs. That was a very dangerous man to antagonize, because it was he and his brother, John Foster Dulles, who basically created the post-war American foreign policy. And here he is firing these guys and getting rid of them and trying to clean the slate and try to draw a different picture, try to draw a different kind of America, the Camelot that we're always talking about. So he antagonized a lot of people. He antagonized the military, no doubt. No doubt in my mind about that. I think nobody has under any illusions about that. He antagonized the American intelligence establishment, which in those days was a lot smaller than it is today.
Sure. Tell us about the Council of Nine and where this fits into this whole picture, Peter.
How much time do you have?
Well, we got another 10 minutes, I think, so.
All right. I'll give you the Reader's Digest, the condensed version. The Council of Nine starts with a seance that was held in 1952, 1953 in Maine. And this goes right again to the Kennedy assassination. As unbelievable as this sounds, it's all true. It's all well documented. You can look it up. And it's in Sinister Forces, and, I talk about it a lot. It was a seance in the woods in Maine. Present at the seance, leading the seance, was a man called Andrija Puharich, who was an inventor. He was very much involved in esoteric studies. He was also a major in the United States Army during the Korean War. He gave lectures to people at Edgewood Arsenal, which is where our chemical biological weapons are developed. He gave a lecture there on the weaponization of ESP and of paranormal abilities. This was a guy who wanted to bring the psychic abilities of America, weaponize them to fight against the Soviet Union. Remember, this was the time of the Korean War, and there was a lot of concern about Manchurian candidates and brainwashing and all of that. Oh, yeah. So he's conducting a seance, And attending the seance are members of America's most elite families. This sounds like it's made up, but it's not. Trust me. You can read it in Puharich's own works. You can read it in the works of the people who were there. And members of this group of 9 people included an Astor, member of the Astor family, a DuPont, Forbes, a Forbes, which means there's a distant relationship to John Kerry, for instance, who ran for president not too long ago, and Arthur Young. Arthur Young was the inventor of the Bell helicopter, a technician, an engineer, a brilliant man, who after World War II decided to leave all that aside and devote himself entirely to studying the paranormal. So you have Arthur Young, his wife, Ruth Forbes Payne Young. She's a Forbes. She was married to a guy called Payne and then eventually married Arthur Young, hence all the names. So Ruth Forbes Payne Young was the best friend of Mary Bancroft. Mary Bancroft was the mistress of Allen Dulles. This is the kind of families we're talking about. Blue blood, very wealthy, very well connected. And there's an Astor and there was a DuPont also present. During the seance, a medium reported what was being said. There was a spacecraft hovering over the world, hovering over the earth, on which there were 9 aliens, let's say, speaking to the 9 people conducting the seance, saying, we are 9 and you are 9. And these 9 forces, these 9 powers in the universe were trying to get this group of 9, this council of 9, to be the seed of this rebirth, this renaissance, or whatever you may have it, on the world, to take care of the world, to bring a new life to the world. Ostensibly, that was the message. It's very vague, and if you read it, it's a lot of platitudes, nothing very concrete. Okay, Arthur Young, Ruth Forbes Payne Young, they developed their own foundation for the study of consciousness out of Philadelphia. And Ruth Forbes Payne Young, her son is Michael Payne, son of her prior husband. And Michael Payne is married to Ruth Payne in Texas, who was the person, of course, who had Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald living with her at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy. So you have this family in Texas, outside of Dallas, in Irving, Texas. You have this family there. Ruth Payne got Lee Harvey Oswald his job at the Texas School Book Depository. She is the daughter-in-law of Arthur Young and Ruth Young, who were at the seance of the 9. She's their daughter-in-law. She went and visited them about 2 months before the assassination, while Marina Oswald was already well known to her with her kids and everything else. She goes up to visit them. We don't know what was discussed. We don't know this because if you read the Warren Commission report on the interrogation of Ruth Payne by the Warren Commission, Allen Dulles is present. And as Ruth Payne starts to talk about her trip to Philadelphia to meet her in-laws, Allen Dulles cuts her off and changes the subject. We never hear anything more about it.
Wow. The most crucial point, just nipped in the bud.
Nipped in the bud. Right there.
Such profound connections for all these figures that we're talking about here, Peter.
Very profound. And, only a handful of people. And they keep reappearing over and over again with their same connections. And they're all involved with esoteric interests, with esoteric studies on the one hand, and with advanced science on the other. You have Arthur Young, who's a brilliant engineer, an aerospace engineer on the one hand, and he's also brilliant in formulating concepts about esoteric interpretations of the universe. It's mind-boggling. And here's poor Lee Harvey Oswald in the middle of all of this. He didn't stand a chance. He had fake bishops, wandering bishops and fake churches on one side. He had the Arthur Young mystics on the other side. He had extreme right-wing crazies on the other side. He was just involved with all of this,
I think he was
and then he's in the school book depository sitting there and he's arrested for the assassination. No wonder he said he's just a patsy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. I don't think he could make a patsy of him. I think he was too intelligent. I think he couldn't have made him into a Manchurian candidate.
No.
You're too intelligent.
I don't think so. He was too smart, and I think he was being manipulated. He thought he was involved in one type of a mission, and it turned out it was another one. And I think what happened was he was manipulated easily, I think, by the people who they told him one thing, but they were doing something else. I think he was a patriot, quite possibly. I think he believed he was a patriot anyway. He had patriotic ideals. I think he worked for the U.S. government while he was a defector in Russia, and I think he maintained that association the entire time. It's just that he didn't know who he was working for. He thought he was still working for the U.S. government, and he may not have been. He may have been working for some strange faction within CIA or within, American military and naval intelligence, ONI, who knows? But, I think that, I think his protestations of innocence were probably sincere.
Yeah, true. I wanted to mention the Council of Nine just to show this, at least the esoteric element to the politics, or at least the political witchcraft. I don't know what way you want to coin the term. The whole thing is incredibly fascinating. It's incredibly complex too, Peter. I mean, you've done a wealth of research. I mean, the list of books you've published on this whole genre, from all the different elements and aspects. I mean, this is a lot of research for you, Peter. I mean, I commend you on that.
Well, thank you. A bit of research. I think the thing that really impresses me the most is that we tend to think in terms of strict categories. You're either this or you're that. But people are much more complex than that.
Yeah.
And there is no separation of church and state in the U.S. except in a very formal way. We elect political leaders who are very religious, and sometimes they have weird religious ideas. Ronald Reagan belonged to the same denomination as Jim Jones, who ran Jonestown. They were members of the same denomination within the Protestantism, the Disciples of Christ. I mean, he believed in the end times. Reagan, he believed in apocalypse. He saw the world in those terms. We have to be careful. We don't separate church and state within ourselves. If we have religious or spiritual ideas, they stay with us. The Nazis are, for me, the touchstone for this. Nazis did not give up. Those who were interviewed at the ends of their lives, living in exile, torturers, mass murderers, when interviewed, would say they would do it all again. They believed they had done the right thing. They wish they had done more. I mean, these were unrepentant people. These were Nazis to the end of their days. These were true believers, and we have true believers everywhere in every country, and this is what we have to be very sensitive to and be aware of.
What's the main aim for the books that you write, Peter? Why this pursuit of knowledge? Is it to set the record straight, to give people a chance at the truth?
Yes, that's of course the main reason. I think ancillary to that is the fact that most people think this kind of stuff is off the wall, is speculative, that I'm making it up. And what I really try to do in all of the books that I publish is to provide the documentation, to provide the resources. People have to know that this documentation is real, that it exists, but I'm not making anything up. I don't speculate unless I say specifically in a book that I am speculating. When I talk about, the relationship between Guy Bannister and Fred Krisman and UFOs, Maury Island, and the Kennedy assassination, this is all documented. You may not look at it the way I do. You may not interpret it the way I do. That's up to you. But I want you at least to have the documentation at your disposal. You have to answer it somehow. You have to clarify, what does it mean? You have to explain it. And I try to explain it, but I leave the documentation there for anybody else to go and search for themselves. I think it's important for us to know that, as Fox Mulder used to say, the truth is out there. We just have to keep looking for it.
I think people don't like the truth. I know, like you say, you have this all documented. I know that's what makes you stand out, Peter, in this genre and research, that you do this research really, really well. I know other people that talk about you, you're just a prolific researcher. That's what they refer to you as. However, I mean, some people just don't like the evidence of the research. They don't like it, and it's like, well, what is there not to like? It's irrelevant whether you like it or not.
Well, yeah, it's not a question about liking. It's a question of this is what we have to deal with. I think a lot of people would rather close their eyes. They want simple black and white answers to everything. We've been brought up in this country that really emphasizes black and white. It's either this or it's that. There's no gray area. There's no room for discussion. If you start to discuss it, try to see the other person's point of view, well, then you're a communist or you're a terrorist or something.
So, yeah, Peter, I mean, to wrap things up, such a clear, well-defined, accurate portrayal of the last 60 years plus, incredible work that you do, Peter. I really thank you for your time today. I can't thank you enough. It's such an interesting, fascinating, intellectual, truthful discussion of facts and events. I really can't thank you enough.
I appreciate it. It's my pleasure, and we want to do it again sometime, I'm always available. Oh,
for sure. I only scratched the surface today. I tried to just do like a round table of a lot of your different books and research. I mean, I know there's some other stuff I haven't really got into. I mean, the whole thing is like a minefield, Peter. It's just like a whole minefield of stuff. I mean, you're courageous to take this on because it's the complexity of it.
It is very complex. It's true. And it's can give you a headache, believe me, trying to keep all the facts together in a row. But it's well worth the effort, believe me. Trying to understand all of this, you begin to see things that people just haven't seen the same way before, and it clears things up a bit. When you're watching the news at night, certain things become a lot more clear because of that. So that's why I do it.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I think there's definitely a benefit for seeking this truth, and if only just to set the record straight. Listen, Peter, I thank you for your time today. PeterLevenda.com. Check out this author. He is awesome.
Of demonic masters. People in the UK and in Ireland, I'm sure you have a lot of stories about the rockets and the blitz that came down that destroyed so much of London and so much of other parts of Europe. And the man who created that technology is the man we brought to the United States to help jumpstart our space program.
For sure.
So, you can't say that these are just a couple of, guys who were just, forced into service by the Third Reich, to do some science, and then we brought them over. I mean, Werner von Braun was a major in the SS. The SS was not the Rotary Club.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't become a major in the SS by simply paying dues every month or something. This was a very serious situation. His boss was even worse, Walter Dornberger. These are people who employed slave labor from the camps. These are people who who worked these people to death, stepped over their bodies on their way into the labs. So let's not be, naive about the people that we brought over.
We'll get into that. I mean, and I want to focus on that. I mean, do we call these people evil or psychopaths, or at least attribute some sort of psychopathy to what they did? We'll get into that. I lived in Plymouth in the UK, in London, and it was really heavily bombed, and even on the roundabout there, we call them a rotary, I think, in America, but there's what we call the bombed out church. It's still an icon in the town to let people know that it was bombed during World War II, and if you asked anybody there, oh yeah, Hitler was the baddie and the swastika, and that's it. That's all people know. And these people lived through this as a wartime. It's still there they're still encouraged to remember the war. It's like a propaganda that's still perpetuated today. However, they have a very, and I too, I can be forgiven for it too, but we have a very sanitized version now, Peter. I want to focus on the occultism. This wasn't just a political party, Peter, that the Nazis rose to power, and it was a political party that got overtaken by one man, and he was a really successful dictator. We can't separate the occultism or the paganism or the esoteric wisdom that these guys had.
No, you can't. As I said in Unholy Alliance, and I've said it often since then, the Nazi Party was not a political party the way we understand.
Great to have you here, Peter. Of course, I want to mention and talk about your latest book, The Hitler Legacy, the Nazi cult in diaspora, how it was organized, how it was funded, and why it remains a threat to global security in the age of terrorism. If that wasn't a punchline for a subtitle, if ever there was one. This is quite a unique genre that you researched, Peter. I can see why you have done this, Peter, because there is a necessity, it's a very, very important necessity, because this has gone unnoticed. This has gone off the record. I mean, literally, we'll get into the JFK stuff as well, and we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the secret space program, the Nazis going to America, NASA space program, and how this all weaves together. But the point is, I think you probably agree, Peter, this has gone unnoticed until really recent years. I think in the 50s, the 60s, people that had no idea about this stuff, Peter, they just were totally oblivious to it all.
Well, sure. The 50s and the 60s were really just the aftermath of World War II, and World War II was framed in this idea that there was a Manichaean struggle between light and dark, between good forces and the evil forces. Mm-hmm. And the evil forces were destroyed, defeated, and light prevailed, and all was right with the world. So there was this idea that, you could compartmentalize reality into these boxes that were easily maneuverable and manageable. And so once we destroyed, the Nazis, then it was a question of the Soviet Union. We needed another evil empire to combat. And so we had the Cold War. So people were so distracted. There was so much misdirection going on and so much disinformation that it was just overwhelming. So people basically took whatever they were told as the truth. And political parties. The Nazi Party was a cult. You can't really describe it in any other way. These were not people who were overly concerned with the things that politicians are generally concerned about. These people were concerned with eradicating races that were considered inferior, of purifying the race. These were people who believed in occult powers. They believed in a sort of spiritual Darwinism, as I call it, where, races are evolving and the other races should be destroyed so they don't, dilute the gene pool. Mm-hmm. These are people who believed in a lot. I mean, if you watch the Nuremberg rallies, alone, that should tell you something. That should tell you this was not the normal political party the way we understand it. In fact, in Unholy Alliance, there's a couple of photographs of what is a torchlit ceremony among a lot of blonde, blue-eyed sort of types out there in the forests, welcoming in the summer solstice. And it's not taking place in Germany or Austria. It's taking place in Argentina. And this was a German community there that was a Nazi party encampment, you might say. And there was Hitler Youth, and there was the origins of an Argentine SS taking place, having candlelit ceremonies. Candlelit ceremonies in the woods on the day of the summer solstice. Is this a political party? Is this, in this country we have the Democrats and the Republicans. You don't see them holding candlelit ceremonies on the summer solstice. Maybe they do, but we just don't know. But in this case, this was what they were all about. They were about an occult view of reality, an occult view of the world and of history. Hitler makes no bones about that in Mein Kampf, but the people who really put that through were people like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who created an entire cult priesthood for the Nazi Party in the SS. Mm-hmm. Even had a castle built where ceremonies were were undertaken, initiatory ceremonies and ceremonies to visualize and make contact with the Aryan ancestors. And all this kind of stuff was going on, and a fortune was being spent to promote this as well.
Sure. I hope I'm reading your bio, or at least a correct bio for you, Peter. You're from a telecommunications background, president of a telecommunications company. How do you get involved in this type of research? What is the attraction? Was there a catalyst there for you, Peter?
Well, I've been involved in international trade really since the 1970s. So that's...
Even me growing up, Peter, I mean, I knew about the Nazi scientists being sought after for their knowledge when the trenches fell, and especially in this part of the world, in Ireland, England, home to the front line as such in France and that. And we always just assumed, and we're taught this in schools, that these guys were just a couple of scientists. They weren't really anything to do with the war, but they had some knowledge and they were given an amnesty.
Sure.
It's really a lot different than that, Peter.
Oh, it is very, very different.
It's scary, Peter. This is scary that this has gone on.
I think it is. That's why I've been focusing so much on it for such a long time. At first, I wanted to find out what motivated people to become Nazis, what motivated the Third Reich in the first place, what created the Nazi Party, what was the idea, the mentality behind it, which is when I wrote Unholy Alliance, because there's so much documentation on the fascination of the people who started the Nazi Party with occultism, esotericism, all of the sort of dark arts, you might say, as well as a lot of very strange racial theories and all the rest of it. They were like the sorcerer's apprentices, and they were going out about it particularly that way. They were creating a magical culture. I mean, the swastika would tell you that, if nothing else. I mean, what other symbol in the last 100 years has been that powerful? You just see it, and immediately you make associations with it. Sure. It's even banned in some countries. In Germany, you can't display it. It has such an enormous radioactivity, you might say. And I wanted to know what that was all about.
And to pay homage to its original source, it was demonized. That was a good logo at one point in Sanskrit in ancient times.
Well, it still is. If you go to Asia today, if you go almost anywhere, from China to Japan, Korea, I lived in Malaysia for a number of years, Singapore, any place like that. You'll find the swastika is everywhere because it's used in Buddhist and Chinese Taoist temples. You'll see the swastika used in a lot of places without anybody giving it a second thought. But in the West, of course, as you say, it's been demonized. And the people who served the swastika were serving what they understood to be these sorts how I got into traveling a great deal all around the world. And as I did, my eyes became open to a lot of things that when you're brought up in the United States, you think in a certain way. It's a kind of very parochial viewpoint you have of the world if you're born and raised in the United States. Once you start traveling to any degree, you begin to realize that the United States is not the entire universe. It's not the entire world. And you begin to see things from different points of view. And you can walk in the battlefields. You can walk in the places where people have suffered so much during various wars. I spent a lot of time in Asia, Europe, Latin America, Australia, almost everywhere. And you begin to realize that there's a lot more to history than what you're told in the history books. And this is important. And my being involved in international trade to a great deal also it encouraged me to learn a lot of different foreign languages. So I was able to, to communicate with people, the places where I went. I began to study their culture, their history, and that gave me access to a lot of information. So as it turned out, every time I was posted somewhere overseas, I used whatever available time I had, free time, in order to investigate these things that I write about, to investigate them even more deeply. Until now, it's become virtually my full-time profession.
Wow, Peter, wow. What a busy guide. I mean, I can understand getting outside America gives you a different viewpoint. I guess you guys maybe have a sanitized version of history over there too, or at least
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so. In fact, I went through, I graduated high school in the Bronx in 1968, which probably tells you how old I am. And at that time, we had history. I was an honors student in history, but we never quite made it up to World War II. For some reason, you never quite made it that far. And I don't know what the reason was, but in all the history classes I ever took, World War II, we never quite made it that deeply in the textbooks. We ended around Sarajevo and, Archduke Ferdinand and World War I. And it was a very sanitized version of that as well. We didn't know what an Austro-Hungarian Empire was in the first place or what that meant. So all of this was kind of murky, and you just had to memorize some names, dates, and places, and that was all. I had to do research on World War II on my own, and it was started with